April 12, 1944. 5:47 a.m. Col du Lautaret, French Alps. The sheep moved first. Restless. Ears flicking toward the valley below. Marcel Fournier noticed immediately. 32 years old, he'd been herding these mountains since childhood. His flock of 140 ewes didn't spook without reason. He set down the wooden staff his grandfather had carved and scanned the pre-dawn darkness spreading across the alpine meadow. The air was cold enough to burn his lungs. Frost clung to wild grass at 2,058 meters elevation. His breath hung visible in the thin mountain air. Below, the valley remained dark. Above, the first pale edge of sunrise touched the peaks. Then he saw them. A column of shadows moving through the tree line 800 meters below. German patrol. 16 men. Maybe 20. Moving with the confidence of soldiers who believed these mountains were theirs. Marcel's hands tightened on the staff. His hunting rifle, a Lebel model 1886/93 his father had carried in the Great War, leaned against a boulder 15 feet away. 8 rounds in the tube magazine. No scope. Iron sights worn smooth by decades of use. The shepherd sniper had a choice to make. He could gather his flock and vanish into the high country. The Germans wouldn't follow. They never did. The altitude and terrain defeated them faster than any resistance fighter. He could be gone before they reached the pass. His wife Marie and their daughter Lisette were safe in the village of Le Monetier-les-Bains, 3 kilometers west. The Germans hadn't bothered with mountain villages. Too remote. Too poor. Nothing to plunder. Or he could stay. Marcel looked at his flock. The ewes had settled again, trusting his presence. They grazed on the sparse alpine grass, utterly unconcerned with the approaching soldiers. Sheep had no concept of war. They knew only the shepherd who protected them from wolves. He moved to the boulder and lifted the Lebel rifle. The wood was smooth from his father's hands, then his own. The metal cold as stone. He'd used this weapon to hunt chamois and ibex in these mountains for 20 years. He knew its quirks. The pull was heavy, nearly 6 kilograms. The sights were off by 3 centimeters at 300 meters, high and right. The barrel heated after 4 shots, which threw the 5th wide. He knew this rifle better than he knew his own heartbeat. Marcel watched the German patrol reach the lower trail. They were advancing in standard formation. An officer leading, probably a lieutenant. 2 scouts forward. The main body in a column. Weapons slung. Moving with the casual arrogance of occupiers who hadn't faced resistance in these mountains for 3 years. They were heading for the pass he was guarding without orders, without authority, without anything except the knowledge that if they crossed into the valley beyond, they would reach his village by noon. Marie was baking bread this morning. He'd left before dawn as always, promising to return by midday with news of the flock. Lisette would be waking soon. She was 7 years old. She'd never known a world without Germans in the valleys. But she'd never seen them in their village. The mountains had kept them safe. Until today. Marcel checked the sun. It would break the horizon in 6 minutes. The Germans would reach the pass in 20 minutes at their current pace. They were moving slowly, altitude already affecting the lowland soldiers. Some were stopping frequently. The thin air at 2,000 meters drained men who weren't born to it. He had advantages they didn't. Lungs adapted to altitude. Knowledge of every boulder, every ridge, every fold in the terrain. And something the German soldiers had lost in 3 years of occupation, a reason to fight that didn't come from orders. He was protecting his flock. His village. His family. The sheep grazed calmly 30 meters behind him. They trusted him completely. They had no idea their shepherd was about to become something else entirely. Marcel worked the Lebel's bolt. The metallic sound was sharp in the mountain silence. He chambered a round. The familiar weight of a loaded rifle settled into his hands. He'd shot thousands of rounds through this weapon. chamois at 400 meters, ibex at 300, wolves at 200. He'd never missed a shot that mattered. This would matter more than any shot he'd taken. He estimated the range to the German officer leading the patrol. 700 meters. Too far for iron sights and failing light. He would wait. Let them come closer. Let them into the killing ground where he hunted for 2 decades. The sun touched the peaks. Golden light spread across the snow-covered summits. The valley below remained in shadow. The German patrol continued climbing. They had no idea a shepherd was watching them. No idea they were being measured by a man who'd spent his entire life learning to read these mountains. Marcel settled into position behind the boulder. He extended the label's barrel through a natural gap in the rock. From 700 meters below, he would be invisible. Just another shadow in the alpine landscape. The rifle's dark barrel wouldn't catch light. His worn brown coat matched the stone and dried grass. His flock continued grazing. Several ewes had moved closer. One stood directly beside him, calmly chewing grass. She had no fear of the shepherd or the rifle. To her, Marcel was safety. Protection. The one who kept wolves away. Today, the wolves wore different uniforms. The German officer called a halt 600 meters below. The soldiers dropped their packs. Several sat heavily on rocks. Altitude sickness was visible even at this distance, men bent over, breathing hard, faces red with exertion. Mountain warfare defeated lowland troops faster than any bullet. Marcel watched and waited. His breathing was calm. His heart rate normal. The thin air that drained the Germans meant nothing to lungs that had breathed it since birth. This was his kingdom. These mountains didn't belong to Germany. They belonged to the men who understood them. The first ray of direct sunlight struck the pass. It illuminated the frost-covered grass with fire. It lit the sheep, turning their wool golden. It reached Marcel's position. And it revealed something the shepherd hadn't seen in the pre-dawn darkness. The German patrol wasn't just passing through. They were carrying surveying equipment. Tripods. Map cases. An officer with binoculars who was now scanning the pass with professional interest. They weren't crossing into the next valley. They were preparing to build something. An observation post. A communications station. Something permanent. If they established a position in this pass, every village in the valley would be within their control. Le Monadier-les-Bains. Saint-Chaffrey. Villard-Late. Thousands of people who had remained free simply because the Germans found these altitudes too difficult to maintain. That freedom was 20 minutes from ending. Marcel adjusted his position. He checked the wind, light, from the west, maybe 5 kilometers per hour. He checked the range again. The Germans were moving, now at 550 meters. Still too far for certainty with iron sights. He would wait until they reached 400 meters. Then he would have perhaps 15 seconds before they identified his position and returned fire. In those 15 seconds, he would need to do enough damage to make them retreat. 1 shepherd. 1 hunting rifle. 8 rounds. Against 16 trained German soldiers with automatic weapons, grenades, and military training. The sheep grazed peacefully behind him. The sun rose higher. The Germans continued their approach. Marcel Fournier, shepherd of the Col du Lautaret, took a deep breath of mountain air and prepared to defend a pass no one had ordered him to guard. The hunter before the war. Marcel Fournier was born on November 3, 1911, in a stone house at the base of the Galibier Massif. His first memory was of his father's hands, rough, scarred, and strong, lifting him onto the back of a mule for the climb to summer pastures. The Fournier family had herded sheep in these mountains for 6 generations. Marcel's great-great-grandfather had grazed flocks on these same slopes during the Revolution. His grandfather had herded here during the Franco-Prussian War. His father had left the mountains only once, for 4 years between 1914 and 1918, when France needed soldiers more than shepherds. Henri Fournier returned from the Great War with 3 wounds, a croix de guerre, and a Lebel rifle he'd carried through Verdun. He never spoke about the war. But he taught his son to shoot. Marcel was 8 years old when his father first put the Lebel in his hands. They were hunting chamois on the north face of the Communat Peak. Henri positioned his son behind a boulder, showing him how to rest a barrel, how to breathe, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. "The mountain gives you one chance," Henri had said quietly. "The animal doesn't know you're there. Then you shoot, and everything changes. You miss, you climb home empty-handed. You hit true, you feed your family for a week." Marcel fired. A clean miss. The chamois vanished into the rocks before he could work the bolt. "Tomorrow, we try again," his father said. They tried again every day for a month. Marcel missed 17 shots before he finally dropped a chamois at 200 meters. His father smiled, a rare expression, and clapped his shoulder. "Now you're a hunter," Henri said. By age 12, Marcel was hunting alone. By 15, he was bringing home ibex from kills at 400 meters. By 20, the older hunters in the valley grudgingly admitted the Fournier boy could outshoot any man in the department. But hunting wasn't Marcel's life. Shepherding was. The sheep came first. Always. He learned their individual quirks. Which ewes were aggressive. Which were timid. Which would lead the flock and which would wander. He learned to read weather in the movement of clouds over the Meije Glacier. He learned which meadows produced the best grazing at which times of year. He learned to smell rain coming 3 hours before it arrived. Most importantly, he learned the mountains themselves. Every trail. Every boulder field. Every creek crossing. Every cave that could shelter a flock during sudden storms. Every ridge that funneled wind. Every slope prone to rockfall. The mountains were his textbooks, and he studied them every day for 30 years. In 1937, he married Marie Dubois, the daughter of a baker from Le Monadier-les-Bains. She was 23. He was 26. They built a small house on the edge of the village, stone walls and slate roof, identical to every other building that could survive alpine winters. Their daughter Lisette was born in May 1938. Marcel was herding summer pastures when word reached him. He left the flock with his cousin and ran 15 kilometers down the mountain in 3 hours. Marie was exhausted but smiling. The baby was small and loud and perfect. "She has your eyes," Marie told him. "And hopefully not your stubbornness." Marcel held his daughter and made a silent promise. She would grow up in these mountains. Free. Safe. She would know the smell of wild grass and the sound of sheep bells and the taste of clean water from glacier streams. Then Germany invaded Poland. France declared war in September 1939. Marcel received mobilization papers. He reported to the depot in Bryankin. The army examined him, noted his age and occupation, and assigned him to a mountain infantry unit. 3 days later, they sent him home. "We need shepherds more than soldiers," the captain told him. "Food is going to matter more than guns before this is over. Go home. Keep your flock alive." Marcel returned to the mountains gratefully. He had no desire to fight in another man's war. He heard enough stories from his father. War was for soldiers and politicians. Mountains were for shepherds. But war came to the mountains anyway. France fell in June 1940. German forces swept through the Low Countries and the Ardennes. The impregnable Maginot Line was simply bypassed. Paris fell. The government fled. Marshal Pétain signed an armistice. In the Alps, life continued almost unchanged. The Germans occupied the major cities and main valleys. They had no interest in the high country. Too remote. Too difficult. Too unprofitable. A few patrols tested the mountain roads, found them impassable in winter, and withdrew. For 3 years, the villages of the Hautes-Alpes remained free by simple geographic isolation. The Germans controlled the plains. The mountains controlled themselves. Marcel continued herding. Marie continued baking. Lisette grew from an infant to a child who could walk the steep trails without fear. The war was something that happened in distant valleys. It didn't touch the high country. Until April 12, 1944. Marcel had seen the signs for weeks. Increased German activity in Bryankin, 25 kilometers northeast. Transport trucks moving through the lower valleys. Reconnaissance aircraft flying over the passes. The Germans were expanding their control, pushing into areas they'd previously ignored. The night before, he'd heard artillery fire from the direction of Italy. The sound echoed strangely in the mountains, bouncing off peaks, making it impossible to determine distance or direction. But it was closer than before. Marie had been worried. Maybe you should take the flock to the western pastures, she'd suggested. Away from the pass. The grass isn't ready there yet, Marcel had replied. Another 2 weeks. Then leave them. Come home early. He'd smiled and kissed her forehead. I've been herding this pass for 20 years. The Germans don't climb this high. They never have. This morning, he'd been proven wrong. Now he lay behind a boulder at 2,058 meters, watching German soldiers approach the pass he'd promised was safe. The pass that protected his village. The pass that stood between his daughter and the war he'd thought she'd never see. His father's rifle was cold in his hands. The Lebel had been carried through Verdun, through the Somme, through 4 years of mechanized slaughter. Henri Fournier had survived all of it and brought the rifle home. Marcel had inherited the weapon. Now he would find out if he'd inherited his father's will to use it when it mattered. The Germans were at 500 meters. Close enough that he could distinguish individuals. The officer in front was young, maybe 25. Tall. Moving with confidence despite the altitude. 2 scouts flanking. The main body behind, struggling more visibly with the thin air. Marcel's flock continued grazing peacefully. The ewes trusted him completely. They had no idea their shepherd was about to transform the mountain meadow into a battlefield. He checked the sun's position. Full light now. No advantage of shadow. The Germans would see his muzzle flash the moment he fired. He would have seconds to relocate after the first shot. But he knew these rocks. Knew every position. Every firing angle. Every covered approach. The Germans were fighting on unfamiliar ground. He was fighting in his home. 450 meters. The officer called another halt. Soldiers bent over, hands on knees, sucking the thin air. One man vomited. Altitude sickness. Marcel felt nothing but steady calm. His breathing was slow. His heart rate barely elevated. This was his element. These mountains didn't make him sick. They made him strong. The Lebel's sights were aligned on the officer's chest. Marcel breathed out slowly. His finger rested on the trigger. 1 shot. Then everything would change. He thought of his daughter. 7 years old. Probably awake now. Probably asking Marie where Papa was. Probably standing at the window looking toward the mountains. He thought of his wife. Baking bread. Expecting him home by noon. Not knowing her husband was about to start a one-man war. He thought of his father. Henri Fournier, who'd survived Verdun only to die of pneumonia in 1940. The old man's final words had been about the mountains. The mountains don't take sides, Henri had whispered. But they protect the ones who understand them. Marcel understood them. Better than any German soldier ever would. 400 meters. The officer was raising binoculars, scanning the pass. The shepherd's finger tightened on the trigger. The Lebel fired. Without orders, without choice. The sound of the shot cracked across the mountain pass like a breaking bone. Sharp. Flat. Echoing off the peaks in multiple overlapping reports that made it impossible to determine direction. 400 meters below, the German officer jerked backward and fell. Marcel didn't wait to confirm the hit. He was already moving. The bolt action was smooth from decades of use. Eject, chamber, close. 2 seconds. He shifted 15 feet to the right, dropping behind a different boulder as return fire cracked overhead. The German patrol had reacted with trained efficiency. They'd hit the ground immediately. Rifles up. Scanning for the sniper's position. But they were searching in the wrong direction. The acoustic confusion of the mountains had them looking southwest when Marcel was directly above them to the north. He settled into his new position and acquired the next target. A sergeant barking orders. 420 meters now, the patrol had scattered, making themselves harder targets. Marcel adjusted for the increased range, held 3 inches high to compensate for the label's known tendency to shoot low at distance, and squeezed the trigger. The sergeant dropped. More return fire. Wild. Undisciplined. The Germans were firing at shadows. One soldier was shooting at a rock formation 200 meters to Marcel's left. Another was aiming at the tree line 300 meters to his right. None of them had identified his actual position. The shepherd's sniper was a ghost. Marcel moved again. The key to survival was motion. Fire from one position, relocate, fire from another. Never stay static. Never give them a fixed target. His father had taught him this hunting wolves in winter. The wolf that stood still died. The wolf that moved survived. He worked the label's bolt and chambered his 3rd round. 5 remaining in the tube magazine. He had to make each one count. There was no resupply. No backup ammunition. After 8 shots, the shepherd would be down to his knife and his knowledge of the terrain. Below, the Germans had finally organized. An NCO, a corporal based on the insignia visible at 400 meters, was positioning men in a defensive line. 3 soldiers were attempting to flank through the rocks to the west. The rest were providing covering fire. They were well trained. Professional. Responding to an ambush exactly according to doctrine. But doctrine was written for lowland warfare. It didn't account for fighting a lone shepherd at 2,000 meters who knew every boulder like he knew the face of his daughter. Marcel shifted position again. He was moving through a boulder field he'd crossed 1,000 times. In daylight, with full visibility, it still took train climbers 30 minutes to traverse. The Germans would need an hour. He could cross it in 8 minutes with his eyes closed. He found his next firing position behind a split boulder that provided a natural loophole. The 3 Germans attempting to flank were exposed on open ground, climbing slowly, clearly struggling with the altitude. One had stopped completely, bent over, breathing hard. Altitude sickness hit lowland soldiers fast at 2,000 meters. Headaches. Nausea. Dizziness. Reduced cognitive function. These men were fighting on half strength, and they didn't even realize it. Marcel put the iron sights on the lead flanker. 450 meters. Wind had picked up slightly, maybe 8 kilometers per hour from the west. He adjusted 2 inches left and fired. The German fell and didn't move. The return fire was immediate and intense. Automatic weapons raked the boulder field. Ricochets screamed off rocks. Stone fragments peppered the air. But none of it was accurate. They were firing at noise, at smoke, at anything that might conceal a sniper. They still hadn't located him. Marcel had already moved. He was 30 feet to the left now, concealed behind a cluster of smaller rocks. His flock was above him, still grazing peacefully. The ewes had barely reacted to the gunfire. They'd heard thunder before. This was just louder thunder. One old ewe, Nicolette, marked by a notch in her left ear, had actually moved closer to the shooting. Sheep were curious animals. Stupid in some ways, but also trusting. If the shepherd wasn't running, there was no reason to run. Marcel checked his ammunition. 4 rounds remaining in the rifle. This needed to end soon. The longer the engagement lasted, the more likely reinforcements would arrive. German patrols operated in coordination. If this unit had radios, and they almost certainly did, backup was already being called. He needed to break their will to fight. Make them retreat. Make them believe they were facing a unit, not a single man with a hunting rifle. The Germans had consolidated their position. They'd formed a defensive perimeter behind rocks, using the terrain effectively. Smart. Disciplined. These weren't fresh conscripts. These were experienced mountain troops. Probably from the 157th Reserve Division based in Grenoble. The corporal was shouting orders. Trying to organize another flanking attempt. 2 men were preparing to move. Marcel waited until they broke cover. Then he fired twice in rapid succession, working the bolt smoothly between shots. Muscle memory from 20 years of hunting. The first shot hit. The second missed high. The barrel had heated, throwing the shot wide exactly as Marcel knew it would. But the effect was psychological, not just tactical. 2 shots in quick succession suggested a semi-automatic weapon. Modern military firepower. The Germans were facing what they believed was an American carbine or a Soviet SVT-40, not a bolt-action rifle from 1886. Their return fire intensified, but it was even more scattered now. Fear was replacing training. 2 rounds remained in the Lebel. Marcel made a decision. He fired 1 shot high, deliberately missing, aiming only to create noise and smoke from a new position 60 feet to the east. The Germans immediately shifted fire toward the new location. While they were distracted, Marcel moved west. Not to a firing position. To his flock. He reached the ewes and grabbed Nicolette. She bleated in protest but didn't resist. Sheep were accustomed to being handled. Marcel guided her and 5 others toward the eastern edge of the boulder field, moving them into view of the German position below. Then he fired his final round. Not at a soldier. Into the air. The sheep bolted at the shot. They ran across the open ground, visible from below. 6 ewes moving fast, kicking up dust, creating motion and confusion. From 400 meters below, in the stress of combat, with adrenaline and altitude affecting perception, the Germans saw movement. Multiple targets. Figures running between cover. They opened fire at the sheep. Marcel used the distraction to relocate again. He moved back to his original position near the highest point of the pass. The Lebel was empty. But he had one more advantage the Germans didn't know about. He had 3 boxes of ammunition cached in a shepherd's hut 200 meters behind his position. 24 rounds total. His emergency supply in case he needed to hunt during extended stays in the high pastures. He ran, a sustainable mountain pace, covering the broken ground quickly, and reached the hut in 90 seconds. It was a simple stone structure, barely 6 feet square, used for shelter during storms. Marcel had built it himself 12 years ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 red paper boxes. Cartouches Françaises. 8 by 50 millimeters Lebel ammunition. He unwrapped them with hands that weren't quite steady. Not from fear. From exertion. Even shepherds felt the altitude after running 200 meters at over 2,000 meters elevation. He loaded 8 fresh rounds into the Lebel's tube magazine. The metallic sound was music. He was back in the fight. When Marcel returned to the firing position, the German patrol was in full retreat. They were carrying 2 wounded. Dragging 1 dead. Moving as quickly as the altitude allowed, which was a fast walk at best. The corporal was maintaining discipline. They weren't running, but they were definitely withdrawing. Marcel watched them descend. He could have fired. Could have added to the casualties. But he didn't. He'd achieved the objective. They were leaving. The pass was clear. The village was safe. For today. As the Germans disappeared into the tree line below, Marcel looked at his flock. The ewes had returned to grazing. Nicolette was calmly chewing grass as if nothing had happened. Sheep had short memories for trauma. Marcel's hands were shaking now. Not from fear. From the aftermath of adrenaline. He just fought a 15-minute gun battle against 16 trained German soldiers. He'd killed at least 3, wounded others. He was a shepherd who'd never fired a shot in anger before this morning. The sun was higher now. Full daylight. Beautiful. The kind of morning that made men grateful to be alive in the mountains. Marcel sat heavily on a rock. He was breathing hard. His heart was racing. His ears were ringing from the gunfire. He could smell burned powder and hot metal from the Lebel's barrel. He looked down at the rifle in his hands. His father's weapon. Carried through Verdun. Now carried through another battle by another Fournier. The stock was warm. The barrel was hot enough to hurt if touched. The mountains don't take sides, his father had said. But they protect the ones who understand them. Marcel had understood them. He'd used every advantage the terrain offered. Cover. Altitude. Acoustic confusion. His knowledge of the ground. His flock as a diversion. He'd won. One shepherd against 16 soldiers. He'd won. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that they would come back. They would come back in greater numbers. With heavier weapons. With officers who understood they'd been humiliated by a lone fighter in the mountains. And when they came back, Marcel Fournier would be waiting. Because he had no orders to follow. No commanders to question his decisions. No higher authority to tell him what to do. He had only the mountains, his flock, and the certainty that as long as he drew breath, this pass would not fall. The shepherd gathered his rifle and moved downslope to retrieve his scattered flock. The ewes followed him willingly. They trusted their shepherd completely. They had no idea he'd just become the most dangerous man in the French Alps. What the flock saw. The Germans returned 3 days later. 40 men this time. 2 squads. Heavy weapons. Mortars. Machine guns. An officer who had clearly studied the terrain and understood he was facing a competent adversary. Marcel watched them assemble at the base of the pass at dawn. He'd been expecting them. Had spent the last 3 days preparing. Creating firing positions. Stockpiling ammunition. Marking ranges to key terrain features with stones arranged in patterns only he would recognize. His flock grazed peacefully around him. 140 ewes, utterly oblivious to the military preparations their shepherd was conducting. To them, Marcel was still just a man who moved them between pastures, who protected them from wolves, who knew which meadows had the best grass. Today, the wolves would be 40 strong. The German officer was smart. He'd sent scouts to high ground on both flanks. He was advancing with the main body up the center while establishing fields of fire from supporting positions. This wasn't the careless approach of 3 days ago. This was professional mountain warfare. Marcel had advantages they didn't. But those advantages were narrowing. He waited until they reached 600 meters. Then he opened fire from a position 150 meters east of where he'd fought before. The Germans immediately returned fire toward his old location. They'd mapped the previous battle. They knew where the shepherd had been. But Marcel wasn't there anymore. He worked the Lebel methodically. Fire. Bolt. Relocate. Fire. Bolt. Relocate. Moving through the boulder field like water flowing downhill. Never staying in one place. Never giving them a fixed target. The sheep continued grazing. They'd heard gunfire before now. 3 days ago. It meant nothing to them. Loud noises were just weather. Thunder. Nothing that concerned animals who lived in the high country. One ewe, Marguerite, identifiable by a distinctive black patch on her left shoulder, actually walked between Marcel and the German position during his 3rd relocation. She was searching for better grass. Completely unconcerned with the bullets cracking overhead. The Germans saw the movement. Saw white wool moving through the rocks. Several soldiers fired at what they thought was the sniper trying to flank them. Marguerite bolted. She ran directly toward Marcel's position, bleeding in confusion. Why was the weather chasing her? Marcel grabbed her as she passed and held her until she calmed. Easy. Easy. His voice was soft. Calming. The voice she'd known since she was a lamb. The sheep settled immediately. Shepherds meant safety. Then Marcel had an idea. He moved Marguerite and 10 other ewes to a position 40 meters to his west. He placed them deliberately, then moved to a firing position with clear view of the German advance. When the soldiers were at 450 meters, Marcel fired twice. Then he moved quickly to the east. The Germans saw muzzle flash and smoke. They returned fire at that position. Their discipline was good, focused bursts, not wild spraying. But they were firing at a location Marcel had already vacated. The sheep, startled by the nearby gunfire, bolted. They ran west across open ground. White shapes moving fast. Multiple targets in motion. From the German perspective, they saw muzzle flash from one position, then seconds later they saw multiple figures moving from that location toward the west. The natural assumption, a squad displacing under fire. They shifted their fire to engage the squad. Machine gun rounds tore through the ground where the sheep had been seconds before. Mortar rounds began falling in that area. The Germans were engaging what they believed was a 6-man resistance unit. Marcel was 100 meters away, watching through the iron sights of his father's rifle. He just used his flock as a decoy. The sheep, utterly ignorant of their role in military deception, simply ran back to their preferred grazing area and resumed eating grass. The engagement continued for 2 hours. Marcel fired 32 rounds. He scored hits on at least 6 soldiers. More importantly, he created the illusion of multiple firing positions, multiple shooters, a coordinated defense. The Germans were professional enough to realize something was wrong with their assessment. But the evidence supported a squad-sized element. Firing from multiple positions. Using terrain expertly. Employing the sheep, whether deliberately or accidentally, as concealment and deception. No one man could do this. That's what the German officer believed. No lone shepherd with a hunting rifle could pin down 40 soldiers with automatic weapons and mortar support. But that's exactly what was happening. By mid-morning, the German advance had stalled at 400 meters below the pass crest. They'd taken casualties. Their soldiers were exhausted from fighting at altitude. And their commander was facing an impossible tactical problem. How do you assault a defensive position when you can't identify the defender's locations? Marcel watched the German officer through his sights. The man was standing behind cover, map in hand, studying the terrain. Smart. Careful. Trying to solve the puzzle of the invisible shepherd. Marcel could have shot him. Clean shot. 380 meters. Light wind. But he didn't. Killing the officer would just bring a more aggressive replacement. Better to let this one continue his careful, cautious approach. An officer who was puzzled was more valuable alive than a new officer who was angry. The sheep continued their casual grazing. They'd spread across the meadow now, completely unconcerned with the battle being fought around them. Several ewes were within 50 meters of German positions. Others were near Marcel's boulder field. They recognized no boundaries. They saw no danger. Their shepherd was present. Therefore, everything was safe. Juliet, a particularly stubborn ewe who'd been causing Marcel problems for 3 years, actually walked directly downslope toward the German line. She'd spotted better grass. She wanted it. Machine gun fire and mortar explosions meant nothing compared to the possibility of superior forage. A German soldier saw her approaching. White shape moving through the rocks. He raised his rifle, then lowered it. Just a sheep. Animal confused by the noise. He actually waved his hand, trying to shoo her away. Juliet ignored him. She reached the patch of grass she wanted and began eating, The soldier stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head and returned to scanning for the sniper who'd been tormenting his unit for 3 days. 20 meters behind him, Marcel had moved to a new firing position. He could have easily shot the German soldier who'd spared Juliet. But the man had shown mercy to a sheep. Marcel decided to return the favor. He shifted his aim to a different soldier who was preparing to fire a mortar round. The label cracked. The mortar crew scattered. The round was never launched. This continued throughout the day. Marcel firing from positions the Germans couldn't identify. The sheep moving randomly, creating false movement, confusing the battlefield picture. The German advance failing to gain ground despite overwhelming firepower advantage. By late afternoon, the German officer made his decision. He ordered withdrawal. His unit descended in good order, maintaining defensive formation, carrying their wounded. They were professionals. They hadn't broken. They'd simply concluded that taking this pass against an unknown force in terrain that favored the defender would cost more casualties than it was worth. As the Germans disappeared into the lower valley, Marcel sat heavily behind his boulder. He was exhausted. Not from physical exertion. From the mental strain of 4 hours of focused shooting. Calculating ranges. Reading wind. Anticipating movement. Making each shot count because ammunition was limited and every miss was a wasted opportunity. His flock gathered around him as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. They pressed close, seeking the comfort of their shepherd's presence. They'd witnessed a battle. They'd been part of it, though they'd never understand their role. To them, today had been like any other day. Grass. Weather. The shepherd's protection. Marguerite pushed her head against Marcel's leg, seeking attention. He scratched behind her ears absently. You helped today, he told her quietly. You and your stupid sisters. You helped. The you had no idea what he meant. She only knew the shepherd's hand was gentle and the evening grass was sweet. Marcel looked down the pass where the Germans had retreated. They would come back again. Next time with more men. More weapons. Maybe aircraft. The Germans didn't accept defeat in the mountains. They would return with overwhelming force. But for today, the pass was held. The village was safe. His daughter would sleep another night without German soldiers in her valley. Marcel gathered his rifle and stood. His knees ached. His shoulders were sore from the label's recoil. He was 33 years old and he felt 60. Come on, girls, he called to his flock. Time to move to the western meadow. The youths followed obediently. They always did. Their shepherd knew where to go. Their shepherd kept them safe. They had no idea their shepherd had just fought 2 battles against 80 German soldiers and won both times. They only knew the grass was good and the shepherd was with them. That was enough for sheep. For Marcel, it was everything. The cost of mourning. The Germans returned one final time on April 23, 1944. 11 days after the first engagement. This time they brought 120 men. 3 full companies. Artillery observers. Mortar teams. Machine gun emplacements on the flanking ridges. And Luftwaffe air support, 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109s circling overhead like mechanical vultures. Marcel watched the assembly from his highest observation point at 2,200 meters. His flock was scattered across the upper meadows, grazing on the sparse vegetation that grew at extreme altitude. The ewes were calm. They didn't understand what the distant sounds of engines and shouted orders meant. The shepherd understood perfectly. This wasn't reconnaissance. This wasn't a probing attack. This was annihilation force. The Germans had committed resources they couldn't afford to waste simply to eliminate one resistance fighter who had humiliated them twice. Marcel checked his ammunition. 43 rounds remaining. He'd rationed carefully over the past 11 days. Conserved every cartridge. But 43 rounds against 120 soldiers wasn't a battle. It was a mathematical certainty. He was going to die today. The realization came without panic. Just cold clarity. He'd known this moment would arrive the second he fired that first shot 11 days ago. You don't fight the German military and expect to survive. You fight because the alternative, doing nothing, is worse than death. Marie knew. He'd told her 5 days ago when he'd made his last trip down to the village. She'd been folding laundry when he walked into their small stone house. Lisette was at school. They were alone. They'll come back, he'd said simply. Marie had stopped folding. Her hands had stilled on a shirt that belonged to their daughter. She'd looked at him with eyes that had known him for 7 years of marriage and 28 years of living in the same village. I know, she'd said. When they do, they'll bring enough men to take the pass. I won't be able to stop them. I know. After, they'll come to the village. They'll ask questions. You need to tell them the truth. That I was up there with the flock. That you didn't know what I was doing. That... Marcel. Her voice had been firm. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know my husband was protecting us. When they come, I'll tell them exactly what you did. And why. He'd started to protest. Started to explain the danger. Started to tell her that defiance would get her arrested or worse. But she'd crossed the room and put her hand over his mouth. You chose to stand in that pass, Marie had said quietly. I choose to stand with you. Even if you're not here. He held her then. For a long time. Neither of them crying. Neither of them speaking. Just holding each other in the small house they'd built together, knowing this might be the last time. When he'd left at dawn the next morning, Lisette had been awake. 7 years old. Smart enough to sense something was different. She'd hugged his leg tightly. Come home soon, Papa, she'd said. I will, he'd lied. Now, 5 days later, standing at 2,200 meters with a hunting rifle and 43 rounds, Marcel understood that his daughter would grow up without a father. She would ask Marie questions. Why did Papa go to the mountains and not come back? Why did he fight soldiers when he was just a shepherd? Marie would tell her the truth. That some men, when faced with evil approaching the people they love, cannot step aside. That shepherds protect their flocks. That Marcel Fournier had looked at German soldiers marching toward his village and made the only choice his conscience would allow. Would Lisette understand? Maybe not now. Maybe not for years. But someday, when she was older, when she had children of her own to protect, she would understand. The German artillery opened fire at 0630 hours. Shells began falling across the upper meadows. Not random bombardment. Systematic. They were working from east to west, saturating every possible firing position. Destroying cover. Turning the boulder fields Marcel had used so effectively into killing zones of shrapnel and concussion. The sheep scattered in terror. The ewes ran in every direction, bleeding frantically, their shepherd trust shattered by explosive violence they couldn't comprehend. Marguerite took shrapnel in her left flank and went down screaming. Nicolette disappeared in a direct hit that left nothing but a crater and red mist. Marcel pressed himself into a crevice between two massive boulders as the world disintegrated around him. The sound was overwhelming. Continuous. Each explosion merged with the next into a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. This was what his father had experienced at Verdun. This was what Henri Fournier had endured for 4 years and refused to speak about. This mechanical apocalypse where individual courage meant nothing and survival was pure chance. The barrage lasted 12 minutes. When it stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. Marcel's ears were ringing so badly he couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine. Blood was running from his nose, pressure damage from nearby explosions. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He checked the label. Still intact. Covered in dust and stone fragments but functional. His ammunition was scattered. He gathered what he could find. 31 rounds left. 12 had been buried or lost in the bombardment. Marcel crawled from his shelter and looked at what remained of his battlefield. The boulder field was barely recognizable. Shells had overturned massive stones that had stood for centuries. Craters pocked the ground. Small fires burned where vegetation had ignited. And everywhere, scattered across the torn earth, were the bodies of his flock. 63 ewes dead. He could see them from his position. White shapes lying still on ground that had been their grazing meadow hours earlier. Animals that had trusted him to keep them safe. Animals he'd failed. The surviving ewes, maybe 77, he couldn't count accurately through the dust and smoke, had fled to the highest ground. They huddled together at 2,400 meters, pressed against the base of the glacier, seeking safety that didn't exist. Below, the German infantry was advancing. 3 waves. 40 men each. Moving with professional discipline. Using terrain. Leapfrogging between cover points. This wasn't the careless patrol of 11 days ago. This was Wehrmacht mountain infantry executing a textbook assault. Marcel settled behind a new firing position. A shattered boulder that provided minimal cover but offered clear fields of fire down to 500 meters. He loaded 8 rounds into the Lebel's magazine. His hands had stopped shaking. The fear had burned away in the artillery barrage. What remained was cold calculation. He couldn't win. But he could make them pay for every meter. The first German soldier reached 450 meters. Marcel shot him through the chest. The man fell and didn't move. The others immediately went to ground and returned fire. Automatic weapons raked Marcel's position. He was already moving. Fire. Bolt. Relocate. Fire. Bolt. Relocate. The rhythm his father had taught him hunting chamois. The rhythm that had kept him alive through 2 previous battles. The rhythm that would carry him through this final one. The Messerschmitt's dove. Their cannons tore apart the boulder field where Marcel had been 3 seconds earlier. 20mm shells detonated against stone, throwing fragments in every direction. One piece of shrapnel caught Marcel's left arm, opening a gash from elbow to wrist. He barely felt it. He fired again. Another German fell. 41 men left in the first wave. 29 rounds remaining in his ammunition supply. The mathematics were impossible. But mathematics didn't account for altitude, or terrain knowledge, or the sheer bloody-minded determination of a shepherd defending his mountains. Marcel killed 6 more men over the next 20 minutes. The German advance slowed. Not stopped. You can't stop 120 men with a bolt-action rifle, but slowed. The officers were being cautious now. They'd learned respect for the ghost sniper of Col du Lautaret. His flock watched from the glacier's edge. The surviving ewes had stopped running. They stood in a tight group, facing their shepherd. Waiting. Sheep always waited for the shepherd to tell them what to do next. Even in the middle of a battle, even with their sisters lying dead across the meadow, they waited for his guidance. Marcel had no guidance to give. He was down to 18 rounds. His left arm was bleeding badly enough that he had to brace the Lebel against rocks because he couldn't hold it steady anymore. German soldiers were at 300 meters now. Close enough that he could see their faces. One was young. Maybe 19. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. Terrified despite his training. He was following orders, advancing into fire, probably thinking about his family in Bavaria or Prussia or wherever German boys were born before being sent to die in the French Alps. Marcel shot him anyway. Because German boys or not, they were climbing toward the pass that led to his village. 17 rounds left. The Messerschmitts made another pass. This time Marcel didn't move fast enough. The 20mm cannon fire caught him across the back, not direct hits but near misses that threw him forward into rock. He felt ribs crack. Felt something tear in his chest. Tasted blood. He rolled onto his back, gasping. Couldn't breathe properly. Punctured lung, probably. Maybe 2. Didn't matter. He still had 17 rounds in Germans at 250 meters. Marcel forced himself upright. Black spots swam across his vision. His legs weren't working correctly, but his hands were steady. The label was still functional. That was enough. He fired. A German fell. The others were close enough now that he could hear their shouts. Officers barking orders. Soldiers calling coordinates. The machinery of military advance grinding toward him. 13 rounds left. Germans at 200 meters. Marcel's flock began moving. The ewes descended from the glacier toward their shepherd. Slowly. Carefully. Walking through the battlefield where their sisters lay dead. Walking past the German soldiers who paid them no attention. Walking toward Marcel. The lead ewe was Marguerite. The stubborn one who'd taken shrapnel earlier. She was bleeding from her flank but still walking. Still coming to her shepherd. Because shepherds meant safety. Even now. Even here. Marcel fired his last 13 rounds methodically. One every 6 seconds. Working the label's bolt smoothly despite the blood running down his arms, despite the broken ribs that made each breath agony, despite the certainty of death that had settled over him like alpine cold. 3 more Germans fell. 10 shots missed, the rifle's barrel was fouled, his vision was fading, his hands were slippery with blood. It didn't matter. He fired until the magazine was empty. Then he dropped the rifle and waited. The Germans reached his position at 0847 hours. 43 soldiers surrounded the boulder where Marcel sat slumped. His flock stood around him. Marguerite had reached him and was pressing against his side. 14 other ewes had followed. They formed a circle around their shepherd. Protecting him. The way she'd protect each other from predators. A German officer approached. Captain's insignia. Mid-30s. Hard face. He looked at Marcel with an expression that might have been respect. "You're the sniper?" he asked in heavily accented French. Marcel nodded. Couldn't speak. His lung was full of blood. "You're alone? Just you?" Another nod. The officers stared at him for a long moment. Behind him, the battlefield was littered with German dead and wounded. 23 casualties from 3 engagements. All caused by one shepherd with a hunting rifle from 1886. "Medic," the officer said quietly. A German soldier pushed forward with a medical kit. He started checking Marcel's wounds. Working professionally. Trying to stabilize the punctured lung, the shrapnel wounds, the broken ribs. Trying to save the life of the man who just killed his comrades. "Why?" the officer asked. "You're a shepherd. Why fight?" Marcel looked up at him. Blood bubbled at his lips when he tried to speak. But he managed 2 words. "My village." The officer nodded slowly. He understood. Orders and strategy and military objectives didn't matter. This shepherd had been defending his home. The oldest reason for war. The only reason that truly mattered. "Your village is 3 kilometers west?" the officer asked. Marcel nodded. "I'll make sure my men don't go there," the officer said quietly. "You've earned that much." Marcel closed his eyes. His flock pressed closer. The ewes were warm against his body. He could hear their breathing. Smell their wool. Feel their trust. He'd failed to protect them. 63 dead. But he'd succeeded in protecting the humans. Marie and Lisette and the 800 people of Le Monadier-les-Bains who would never know how close German soldiers had come to entering their valley. The German medic was working frantically. But Marcel could feel himself fading. The cold spreading from his core. His father had described this feeling. The moment when you know you're dying and there's nothing to do but accept it. "Shepherd," the German officer said. His voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's your name?" Marcel tried to answer. But the darkness was too close. The cold too deep. His last conscious thought was of Lisette, 7 years old, standing at the window watching for her father who would never come home. The shepherd's eyes closed. His flock stood vigil around him. The ewes didn't understand death. They only knew their shepherd had stopped moving. They waited for him to stand, to lead them to new pastures, to protect them from wolves. They would wait a long time. Erased from the record. The German officer was Captain Wilhelm Steiner, 157th Reserve Division, Wehrmacht Mountain Infantry. He filed his after-action report on April 24, 1944. The report was clinical, precise. It documented 3 engagements at Col du Lautaret between April 12 to 23, 1944. Total German casualties, 23 dead, 14 wounded. Enemy force, estimated 6 to 8 resistance fighters with military training, possibly former French Army mountain troops. Recommendation: avoid future operations in this sector due to difficult terrain and entrenched resistance. The report never mentioned a shepherd. Never mentioned a lone man with a hunting rifle. Never mentioned sheep grazing in a battlefield. Captain Steiner understood that admitting his division had taken 37 casualties from a single civilian would destroy morale and invite questions about competence. So he lied. In the official record, the ghost sniper of Col du Lautaret became a squad of trained soldiers. The humiliation became an acceptable loss against a worthy enemy. The truth disappeared into military bureaucracy. Marcel Fournier's body was carried down to Le Monadier-les Bains by German soldiers under Captain Steiner's orders. They laid him in front of the village church. Then they departed without entering any homes or questioning any civilians. Steiner kept his word. Marie found her husband at noon. She didn't scream. Didn't cry. She simply knelt beside him and held his hand until the village priest arrived. Later, when Lisette came home from school, Marie told her daughter that Papa had protected the mountains. That he'd kept soldiers away from their home. That he'd been very brave. Lisette cried. Marie held her. The village buried Marcel Fournier 3 days later in a small cemetery that overlooked the valley he died defending. 70 people attended. No one spoke of resistance. No one mentioned the battles. In occupied France, silence was survival. Marcel's flock was recovered by his cousin Robert. 77 ewes remained alive. They were divided among local shepherds. Marguerite, the stubborn one who'd been wounded, survived and lived another 6 years. She never forgot her original shepherd. When Robert brought her to high pastures near Col du Lautaret, she would always move toward the boulder field where Marcel had made his stand. Seeking him. Waiting for him. The war ended 13 months later. Germany surrendered. The liberation came. And slowly, the stories emerged. In 1947, a French army historian investigating resistance activities in the Hautes-Alpes region heard rumors about a shepherd who'd fought German soldiers in 1944. He interviewed villagers in Le Monadier-les Bains. Most claimed to know nothing. A few mentioned Marcel Fournier. A farmer. A shepherd. A quiet man who died during the occupation. The historian found no military records. No resistance networks claimed him as a member. The Free French had no documentation of operations at Col du Lautaret. As far as official records showed, Marcel Fournier had never fought anyone. The historian moved on to documented cases. The shepherd was forgotten again. In 1953, Marie Fournier died of pneumonia. She was 39 years old. Lisette, now 16, inherited her parents' small house. She continued living in Le Monadier-les Bains, working in the bakery where her grandmother had worked. She married in 1959. Had 2 sons. Told them stories about their grandfather the shepherd who'd loved the mountains. She never mentioned the battles. What her mother had told her in private, the truth about how her father died, remained private. The official story was safer. Marcel Fournier had been killed in crossfire during a German patrol operation. A civilian casualty. Nothing more. The truth stayed buried for 47 years. In 1991, German military archives were opened to researchers. A French historian named Claude Vernet was studying Wehrmacht operations in the Alps. He found Captain Wilhelm Steiner's after-action reports from April 1944. The reports mentioned engagements at Col du Lautaret. Heavy casualties. Resistance force estimated at 6 to 8 fighters. But Vernet was thorough. He cross-referenced German records with French resistance databases. No resistance unit operated at Col du Lautaret in April 1944. The FFI had no cells in that region. The Maquis avoided those mountains, too exposed, too difficult to supply. So who had killed 23 German soldiers? Vernet traveled to Le Monadier-les-Bains in 1992. The village had changed. Tourism had discovered the Alps. Ski resorts brought money and modernization. The small stone houses were now hotels and restaurants. The old cemetery was maintained by the municipality. He found Marcel Fournier's grave by accident. A simple stone marker. Birth date. Death date, April 23, 1944. Nothing else. Vernet interviewed elderly villagers. Most had forgotten. A few remembered a shepherd named Marcel. One woman, 83 years old, memory fading, remembered something about Germans at the pass. About sheep and gunfire. About Marie Fournier, who'd never remarried after her husband died. Vernet found Lisette Fournier Bonnet. She was 55 years old, living in Grenoble. When he asked about her father, she'd been silent for a long time. My mother told me not to talk about it, she finally said. Your mother has been gone for almost 40 years, Vernet replied gently. Your father deserves to be remembered for what he did. Lisette studied him. Then she opened a drawer and withdrew a wooden box. Inside was her father's Croix de Guerre from World War I, Henri Fournier's medal, passed down to Marcel, then to Lisette. My father was a shepherd, she said quietly. He'd never been a soldier. But when German soldiers came to his mountains, he stopped them. My mother said he fought for 11 days. Alone. With his father's rifle. He killed more than 20 Germans before they finally brought enough men to kill him. She paused, touching the metal gently. She said the Germans carried his body down to the village themselves. That their officer promised her they wouldn't enter the valley. That my father had earned that much. She waited until I was older to tell me. She didn't want me to be proud of violence. She wanted me to understand that sometimes, men have to stand in impossible places and fight impossible battles because the alternative is letting evil pass unchallenged. Vernet wrote it all down. He published his findings in a 1993 academic journal, The Ghost Sniper of Col du Lautaret, a case study in civilian resistance. The article was read by approximately 200 historians and academics. It generated no popular interest. In 2001, a local history society in Briançon erected a small plaque at Col du Lautaret. The inscription read, In memory of Marcel Fournier, 1911-1944, shepherd of these mountains, who defended this pass against overwhelming odds, April 1944. Hikers pass it occasionally. Most don't stop. A shepherd from 60 years ago doesn't compete with modern distractions. The mountains remember, but humans forget. Lisette Fournier Bonnet died in 2009. She was 72. Her sons inherited their grandfather's Lebel rifle. It hangs in a farmhouse in Haute-Savoie. The metal is pitted with rust. The stock is cracked. But it still exists. The Col du Lautaret Pass remains open. Tourists drive through during summer months. Cyclists challenge its elevation. The boulder fields where Marcel fought are unchanged. Sheep still graze the high meadows. Different flocks. Different shepherds. But the mountains are eternal. If you stand at 2,058 meters on an April morning, when the frost clings to the grass and the sun is just breaking the eastern peaks, you can almost see him. A shepherd with a rifle. Protecting his flock. Holding a pass that military strategy would have abandoned. Fighting because withdrawal meant letting wolves, human wolves, reach his village. History didn't record his stand. Military historians barely mention him. The French government never awarded him a medal. His name doesn't appear in textbooks about World War II resistance. But the mountains remember. And somewhere in those high pastures, the descendants of his flock still graze. Trusting their shepherds. Believing in protection. Unaware that 60 years ago, their ancestors witnessed one man's war against an army. Marcel Fournier, shepherd of Col du Lautaret, died on April 23, 1944. He was 33 years old. He'd killed 23 German soldiers and wounded 14 others across 3 battles. He held a mountain pass for 11 days without orders, without backup, without recognition. His flock witnessed everything. The sheep couldn't tell the story. But the mountains could. And finally, decades too late, someone listened.